Hi, I'm Tim Stout. It is late July in 2020. By now, we should be well on our way to recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, the number of new cases each day is setting all-time high records in our country. What went wrong? New therapeutic drugs were announced last March, which have a good probability of bringing the pandemic under control. Instead, they sit idly on a shelf. Why? Because of needless built-in delays in the new drug approval process that are required by law. Unless you like wearing masks in public, unless you like not being able to mix freely with your friends, unless you like watching our economy get destroyed and jobs disappear, I suggest you seriously consider what we will be looking at in this video. Laws that are reasonable and desirable under normal conditions become the biggest cause of death in a pandemic. In this video, I will show how this problem can be fixed. We will also see how risk can be kept to a minimum. Before we start, please note that a free transcript of this video is available here. A free copy of it in DVD format is available here. At this point, I will present a summary of the protocol. Afterwards, I will make the case why it is so important to implement. I will also work through the protocol in much greater detail. 1. Pandemics spread and become entrenched extremely rapidly. 2. The only hope to stop a pandemic or to minimize its impact to a safe level is rapid approval of new drugs specifically designed to fight it. 3. Built-in delays of current drug approval processes guarantee that a pandemic can become entrenched and widespread during the approval process. 4. During a pandemic under this new protocol, everyone is fighting the same disease. It is not necessary for each company to negotiate the same basic steps of testing for approval. 5. In the protocol here, the steps defining the testing processes are codified in a computer program. As each person in the test is treated, treatment results are observed, reported on a scorecard, and uploaded to a computer. The computer instantly recalculates the status of a drug as each person is tested with it. 6. Initially, close monitoring of patients' responses would be defined in the protocol. As more patients are tested with the drug and the results monitored, the drug is either removed from the program or, as confidence in its safety and effectiveness is increased, it is made available to a larger number of people. In time, it can become an officially approved drug where any doctor can prescribe it at will. 7. It is recommended that a separate agency be created to administer this protocol, one whose interest is primarily focused on emergency response to a pandemic. The mindset required to implement it properly is contrary to the normal mindset appropriate for more normal conditions. The material presented in this video is a summary of more detailed information I have posted on a preprint server. You can download it free of charge at the URL shown here. Discussion of the new protocol starts on page 11 of version 5 of the article. Last March, as I was studying what's going on with this virus, trying to figure out, is it man-made, is it a natural spillover, all these kinds of questions, I became aware that a number of companies had developed what are called therapeutic drugs. These are ones that treat the disease. Yet, these drugs, to this day, about 150,000 deaths later, still sit on a shelf. Why? Because of the laws which define how a new drug has to be approved. Now, concerning my background, I have a degree in physics from UCLA, and I've got a couple of decades of design engineering experience with computers and their application. And there's a certain mindset that has become ingrained in how you look at things. I took one look at the FDA protocol and I thought, you know, this would be a natural for computer design. And what I came up with here, I believe, could be a game changer. We need to get it implemented to get rid of human interaction. There's no way a human being can keep up with a computer. You just simply have a doctor, he treats somebody, he gives various numerical evaluations of what happened, he submits it to the computer, and the computer instantly decides, whoa, we got a problem with this drug, or hey, this drug's doing really well. And one particular report doesn't mean anything, but when you begin to see a pattern, then the computer can detect those patterns. And in a very limited number of people, it can determine which drugs are being effective and which aren't. When you have 150,000 people dying because a drug is on a shelf, even if the protocol isn't going to be, quote, perfect, it's going to be a very minimum risk, and it's needed to get rid of the problem. So just a little bit about how this protocol was developed, my background, and why I believe in many ways it's the perfect background to develop something like this. As if COVID-19 were not causing enough problems, the Chinese government has announced that they are now fighting a new virus called G4 that could turn into another pandemic. Here is their announcement. Also, the science journal Nature is generally considered the most prestigious science journal in the world. It has echoed the concern from China. The last thing we need is to face a new pandemic while we are still reeling from COVID-19. COVID-19 by itself is severe enough. The result of adding a new one to it is beyond comprehension. It could be nearly impossible for our nation to survive the financial pressures this could bring. Two separate, simultaneous pandemics could well result in the financial collapse, not only of our country, but also of the whole world. China is already talking about this as a possibility. We need to prepare for this as a reasonable possibility now while we still have some degree of economic strength left. In a pandemic, many drug companies are fighting the same disease. This common focus allows shortcuts not otherwise possible. So, even though the protocol presented here is only suitable for use during a pandemic, in a pandemic it may well provide the only hope for survival. The Big Mismatch. The problem is a mismatch between the speed with which a pandemic can become entrenched and spread and the legally forced delays before new drugs can be used that could fight it. For instance, according to Worldometer.com, the first death from COVID-19 was reported in Washington State on February 29, 2020. A month later, on March 29th, there were 3,280 deaths. 2 months later, on April 29th, there were 62,823 deaths. 3 months later, there were 106,541 deaths. Yet, current regulations have a built-in minimum 4-month delay from the time a new drug is announced and the first human trials can take place. So, if a new drug had been ready to start testing on February 29th, then over 100,000 people could have died, yet there would still be at least a month to go before human testing could begin. With the new protocol I'm proposing, these 4 months are wiped out. They're removed. In a pandemic, human trials could start within days of when they are ready. So, if it is possible to just wipe out these delays, why are they there? It is a matter of perspective. It normally takes 5 to 10 years to get regulatory approval of a new drug. 4 months is irrelevant from this perspective. In the case of a pandemic, it is disastrous. There are two separate causes for the delay. The first delay, animal trials. Under current law, a drug company can't even apply to the FDA for approval of a new drug until the drug has first been tested in animals for safety. This typically takes 2 or 3 months. However, people and animals are different. A drug may be safe in animals and still not be safe for people, and vice versa. Therefore, even after animal trials, the drug is initially given in very small doses in the first few people to take it to ensure that it does not have serious problems. The amount is gradually increased until it should begin to show some kind of results. Eventually, the ideal dose is determined. The real purpose of the animal trials is to ensure the safety of the first 20 or so people to get the drug. 3 months to give this added protection are irrelevant for an approval process that could take 5 to 10 years. This is an unacceptable delay during a pandemic. In truth, there is very little risk in going directly to humans if small enough doses are given initially. So, more than 100,000 people can die in a pandemic just during animal trials. For what purpose? To slightly reduce the risk for the first 20 or so people taking the drug. This makes no sense. The second delay, time taken to process the application. If the animal tests go well, then the company files an application with the FDA. This starts an elaborate approval process where the company describes what it wants to do, the FDA analyzes the proposal to make sure everything is safe, and then an elaborate test scheme is worked out between the FDA and the company. This normally takes a very long time. It can even take years under normal conditions. However, the FDA has been cooperating with drug companies during the COVID-19 pandemic, and 2 to 3 months for approval seems to be more characteristic. Notice, we're not talking about approval to use the new drug on a large scale in an effort to start fighting the pandemic. The negotiations are only for permission for a company to start small-scale limited testing on the first people to get the drug. Full approval is still a long way off. These delays are troubling when one considers that new drugs are the only true weapons to fight the pandemic and how urgent it is to get them into immediate use. It is troubling when one thinks about how many people are dying each hour of these negotiations. Yet, realistically, COVID-19, as lethal as it is relatively mild compared to some viruses. For instance, in 2012, there was an earlier coronavirus epidemic in the Middle East which also caused severe pneumonia. It was called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. MERS is extremely severe and deadly. About 35% to 40% of the people getting it die. Fortunately, MERS was stamped out before it got firmly established. By contrast, 80% of the people that get COVID-19 are symptomless and do not even know they have it. When this is taken into account, it appears that only about 1% of those infected by COVID-19 actually die from it. So, of those getting infected, 35 times as many people die from MERS as from COVID-19. Suppose COVID-19 were as deadly as MERS. If 35 times as many people were to die from COVID-19 as actually have died, there could be well over 4 million people killed by the virus in our country already. At some points in April and May, there could have been 70,000 people dying each day. How could we even legally bury this many people? Yet, according to the law, we would still need to go through months of animal trials to slightly reduce risk for the first 20 or so people getting the drug. A drug company would still need to go through months of negotiating with the FDA on how to begin small-scale trials. Yet, while the FDA agent took a lunch break, 3,000 people would have died. Laws and procedures designed to protect life under normal conditions can result in overwhelming death during a pandemic. These laws are literally capable of destroying our country in a pandemic. They need to be changed. So how do we implement blazing speed and reasonable safety at the same time? Maybe this is the way to go.
Here we are, riding in a minivan with nobody in the front seat, with pedestrians and cyclists and other vehicles out on a public road. It's a surreal experience.
This car was computer-driven, not human-driven. To drive a car in a public setting with pedestrians darting in and out requires very rapid and very sophisticated calculations. If a computer can make instant decisions while driving a car at speed down a public street, dodging cars and bicycles and pedestrians, maybe it can make instant decisions in running a drug approval protocol under emergency conditions. The Stout protocol. We need a new protocol which is designed to allow a new drug to start immediate testing on a small number of people once certain minimal qualifications have been met. Animal trials are skipped unless the company itself wants them. I suggest creating a new government agency to implement the emergency protocol. Just as an army and a police force both have similar purposes in protecting the welfare of the public against bad guys, the Army represents an emergency situation and the police force represents a normal situation. Despite their similarity, they have completely different mindsets and approaches. It is proven more effective to separate the two functions. I suggest the same situation is relevant to fighting a pandemic. For convenience, I refer to the new agency as CEER, Center for Emergency Epidemic Response. It is almost impossible to change the culture and mindset of an established bureaucracy, particularly one which is accustomed to exercising tight control over minute details. The protocol applies only for therapeutic treatments when an epidemic emergency has been declared by the President of the United States, or POTUS as he is sometimes called, and ratified by the U.S. Senate. It is to be effective for a limited time, subject to extension if needed. Upon Senate ratification, new drugs become exempt from current regulations and subject to new ones to be administered by CEER. This exemption is not taken lightly. It is why Senate confirmation is required. Computer response is fast, effectively, instantly. The ability to make complex analyses of data in an instant and post the results just as quickly is unique to computers. People cannot compete. In the new protocol, to avoid human interaction delays, a computer, programmed with a predetermined procedural specification, gives automatic control of the entire process for approval of new drugs. The FDA has done a good job of defining the steps and phases of new drug approval. This is the formal document which defines the legal steps required to get a new drug approved. It is easy to understand and thorough. It is a good starting point for defining the procedural specification as well as the entire computer interaction scheme. However, there's a fundamental incompatibility between the urgency necessary to fight a pandemic and the meticulous approach appropriate for normal conditions as defined here. It is this incompatibility which results in needless delays and needless deaths during a pandemic. A major element of my new protocol is resolving this incompatibility. The FDA document is designed to apply to everything from over-the-counter drugs where side effects are not generally tolerated to cancer drugs whose serious adverse reactions are barely compensated for by their effectiveness in killing cancer cells. The details of approval between these two kinds of drugs share very little in common. It takes lots of personal interaction between the FDA and a drug sponsor to determine how to test properly whatever kind of drug might show up next in the new drug applications. By contrast, new drugs for the new protocol are specifically limited to therapeutic drugs for the specific disease causing the pandemic. Basically, everyone is dealing with the same issues. So, instead of each company independently, gradually working through essentially the same steps, the steps are predefined in the computer procedural specification. A company merely needs to check out the information on the public website to know what is expected of it. For us here, it is adequate to recognize that it is the specialization associated with focus on a single disease that allows the computer to control the approval process automatically. The overriding goal is to stop the pandemic. Doing this successfully requires the ability to update the procedural specification as various conditions change in the course of the pandemic. The entire protocol emphasizes speed and doing everything possible either to stop the pandemic or at least to reduce significantly its impact. The computer gives the public complete open access to almost everything taking place in the trial. This is primarily to allow potential volunteers and their physicians a sound basis to understand the risks involved in participation in a trial. It is also a place where SEER can make available to the public a broad resource of information about the pandemic in general. A drug sponsor, such as a drug company, university, or a research center, which has developed a new drug, fills out an application form and submits it to the computer. It tells what it wants to test and why it is qualified. If SEER approves the application, the company is allowed to start testing immediately. When a company submits its application, public parts of the application are immediately posted for anyone to read. The physicians of people who would like to participate in the trials submit an application to the computer acknowledging the potential patient's availability. The physician and the patient work together to choose which drugs might be appropriate for them to use. The computer automatically transmits the application to the appropriate drug company. The company selects people it wants for the trials. The drug company then works directly with the personal physician for treatment. The heart of the protocol is a scorecard. After a physician treats his patient with a drug, he monitors the results and records them on a scorecard, which is then uploaded to the computer. The scorecard lists a number of issues including the initial health status of the patient, the apparent effectiveness of the drug, any observed side effects, and whether the physician would recommend stopping the trial, continuing it on a limited basis, or increasing the number of people included in the trial. SEER will typically have a number of other issues to be reported as well. Once the physician submits the scorecard to the computer, everything becomes automatic. Scorecards are immediately posted as public information. The computer analyzes all of the scorecards for a given drug. The computer calculates a new score immediately upon receiving a new scorecard from a patient's doctor. As the score for a specific drug gets higher, additional patients are allowed into the program, and gradually less monitoring for adverse reactions is required. If the score goes below a certain value, the drug is removed from the program. The new scores are also automatically posted for public view. The procedural specification is a living document. SEER continually needs to update the procedural specification as the pandemic changes in scope and as doctors discover newly observed issues that need to be monitored and reported. Repurposed drugs. Repurposed drugs are ones that have been approved for treating certain diseases, but not the ones desired. There can be a gray area when they are allowed and when they are not. There can be a gray area of legal liability for a doctor or hospital using them. There can be a gray area whether insurance covers their costs. A major responsibility of SEER would be to define a protocol formally allowing a controlled use of repurposed drugs within the protocol. A typical example of repurposing would be the Math Plus protocol developed by a group of doctors treating COVID-19 firsthand. It is discussed at this URL. They found that their COVID-19 patients appeared to die from blood coagulation problems more than lung problems. They devised a treatment based on treating these problems and found they had a very high rate of success, particularly for hospitalized patients who started treatment soon enough. Yet, very few people know this treatment and use it. The new protocol could help in these ways. 1. Provide a common site where all drugs under investigation can be easily discovered and their effectiveness tracked. This would help people find out about them and decide whether or not to volunteer to use them. 2. Provide a legal safe haven for doctors and hospitals who might otherwise be reluctant to take the legal risk for a repurposed drug unless it is covered in the protocol. 3. Legally allow the full cost of treatments to be covered by insurance for both hospitals and doctors. Math Plus is not the only repurposed drug with potential. It is only representative. However, if these new policies had been in place to already be allowing early on official testing and reporting of repurposed drugs, there is good possibility that the pandemic and its effects would not have been as severe as what we are now facing. The survival of our country depends on fixing the protocol problem as quickly as possible. We're not prepared to handle new pandemics at this time. We're actually still not prepared to handle this one. Please share this video with your friends. Please share it with your congressmen, your U.S. senators, and talk show hosts. This completes our discussion of the new protocol. If you found this information useful and informative, please give me a thumbs up. Please also consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for your time.